I would have been the last person anybody would predict would become an overprotective parent. And I'm not saying overprotective socially. Like my wife and I definitely encouraged our kids to participate in all the kid activities and in sports and have a lot of friends and take a lot of play dates and that sort of thing. So I'm talking about their safety. And the reason why I say nobody would have predicted that I would have become sort of the ultimate helicopter parent is it's because I think it'd be fair to say I was a pretty wild kid. Nothing scared me. I remember when I was a teenager hitchhiking from New Hampshire to Connecticut in like the dead of winter, or my friend and I were in New York. We missed the last train to Connecticut. So in the middle of the night, we hitchhiked home from there. We used to hang out in like the diviest bars in the worst section of one of the worst cities in terms of crime in the country. It was Bridgeport. And, back then the drinking age was 18. So when we were in high school, we used to go into like the worst sections of Bridgeport, just hang out until all hours of the night. And it never fazed me, didn't scare me. Even as an adult, I remember when I graduated from law school, moved to Boston to start a job at a law firm, I bought just a regular bicycle. I was living in Somerville, right on the edge of Cambridge. And I remember riding my bike down Mass Ave, just main road in Cambridge, just weaving in and out of traffic. Cars would be honking at me, whatever. Didn't faze me. But then when I had kids, it was like I became the polar opposite. I was just scared to death about them getting hurt or, getting killed, whatever. Just worried about their safety. When they were, of the age, I don't know, it's like 5 or 6 years old, and we got them bicycles. I let them ride bikes, but only in the driveway, not even in the neighborhood. I was just so afraid of a car hitting them. That's just one example. Another, when my son Christopher was probably around, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, the kids started playing football. They played football in recess. They played football on play dates. And I was so worried about him getting a concussion or some, head injury. I remember emailing all the other dads and saying, hey, when Christopher's at your house on a play date, I don't allow him to play football. And I know they thought I was crazy. And some of them, wrote these kind of obnoxious emails in response. And that's okay. But I was so overly concerned about it. I think the worst was when they were able to swim, but not really great. And, the kids were having these, the birthday parties. And if somebody had a swimming pool and the party involved swimming, I did this more than once. I would call the parents. I'd say, hey, do you mind if I come and just kind of sit by the pool? We're just really worried. We are just really worried about, the kids in swimming pools. And the parents were always very nice. And they were like, oh, yes, of course. And I would go to these little parties and I would just sit by the pool and just watch my two kids and the other kids too. I was just, kind of crazy. And I don't know why. I don't know why I kind of made that flip. I kind of went from one extreme to the other. It could just be that I was an older parent. Like my wife and I got married sort of late in life. When we had the twins, I was 43. So it could be that. I think it's because I was in a really bad accident, when I was in my sort of mid-late 30s. I was walking down the sidewalk and this like ninja motorcycle hit me from behind. I didn't even see it coming. It threw me. I don't really remember much, but all my bones were broken. I lacerated my liver, punctured my spleen. I was in Mass General for weeks, had surgeries, and I was in rehab. So I think it's almost like maybe a PTSD thing, that this motorcycle came out of nowhere, just as random bad luck, and I got so poorly injured. I mean, it could be that. So I don't know what it is, but it was definitely extreme. Here's the thing, I knew that my fears, letting the fears get the best of me, was not good for my kids. Now, don't get me wrong. I think with kids, you certainly have to, consider their safety every day, but you need to take a balanced approach. You don't want to have your kids do things that put their lives or safety at risk. But you also have to, moderate that. You can't be extreme. And I was extreme to the point where it was kind of getting in the way a little bit of their growth, and it started to bother me. Like I started to realize, like, this isn't good. Like I really gotta let go a little bit here. And I think the turning point was I was talking to somebody at work who I barely knew. It was somebody like not even from Massachusetts, where we live. It was, I think she was from the Midwest, and we just started chatting, and she said, "Oh, in Massachusetts, my daughter goes to summer camp." And as it turned out, it was pretty close to where we live. And she said she just absolutely loves it. She's around 15 years old. She's really into horseback riding. This camp just focuses on, horseback riding for the kids. That's what they do. It's a girls' camp. And as she talked about it, it just sounded awesome. Like that. She said, my daughter has matured so much, and she's been there. She's become a lot more confident. She looks forward to it all year. And she kind of went on about it. And I was just like, man, that sounds like just such a great experience. So I went home, I talked to my daughter. I said, would you ever be interested in going to sleepaway camp? And this one in particular, it's all about horseback riding. She's like, maybe, yeah. So, my wife and I and Coco, and we brought my son Christopher, we went to visit this camp. It was a very kind of basic, it wasn't a fancy camp at all. Like, it wasn't like they had a lot of scheduled activities. Really, truly, everything was kind of focused on the horseback riding. It was, the bedrooms, the buildings they're kind of rough. I thought it was cool. It was very, very country-ish. The kids were very like laid back, kind of typical horse people, right? And my daughter, she liked it, but she didn't love it. She was kind of like, I'm not sure this is quite my vibe. I said, all right, that's okay, but would you consider another camp? And she said, yeah, I would. So I called one of my closest friends, my friend Carl. He's on the board of, he's really big in the whole camp thing. He's on the board of the New England Camp Association. And we talked about it quite a bit, and he really talked it up, the benefits of it. And he said, my daughter went to camp up in Maine, Camp Renoya. Maybe you should check that out. And by the way, my son, Jesse, went to Camp Cabian up in New Hampshire, and he's been there for years, absolutely loves it. So then I talked to Christopher. I was like, would you consider going to camp? And he said, yeah, I'd consider it. So, my wife and I and the two kids, we checked out Renoya, checked out Cabian. And long story short, the kids were totally into it. And I said to my wife, like, are we really going to do this? I got to tell you, my upbringing, if anything, made me not inclined to. I never thought in a million years I would send my kids to overnight camp. I grew up in a neighborhood. It was probably like 60 or 70% Jewish families. I grew up about an hour outside of New York in Connecticut. A lot of the families, moved from New York into the suburbs, and I only mention the ethnicity because I think it is something in the Jewish American culture. A lot of families send their kids to overnight camp. They just see the value in it. In my neighborhood, just about every kid went to sleepaway camp. My mom and dad, we grew up Greek Orthodox. They were kind of overprotective Greek parents. They said, well, that's great. The other kids do that, but we would never send you kids to overnight camp. We just love you too much. We wouldn't that. We want you with us during the summers. We wouldn't just put you, with somebody else, under somebody else's care. So that was kind of like my impression of it. My proclivity was like, no way. But, and I thought to myself, this is good for them. I got to get over it. And, that whole thing about me being overprotective, I realized I just had to start letting go. So we sent them to camp. I didn't know, going into the whole camp thing was that, in certain camps, including, Renoya and Cabian, where my kids went, as a parent, you do not have any direct contact with your kids. You cannot talk to them on the phone. There's no texting. There's nothing. The only thing you could do is write letters, snail mail. So that's what my wife and I did. We wrote a lot of letters. And the kids did fine. It wasn't until, they came back, my son said, I was like super homesick the first few days. And thank God I didn't know that. It would have really bothered me. But they did great. I remember one time, my wife and I were on, we were on the websites all the time just to see, because sometimes the camps post pictures. And we were looking at the pictures. We always look to see if there's any of our kids in the photos. And there was one, And I was like, oh my God, that's Coco. And she was like on the ground with like a helmet and headphones with a rifle, shooting a gun, which I didn't even know I don't think I even knew they were doing that there. And I was just like, oh my God, of all people, me, the ultimate helicopter dad, when I saw my dog with a rifle, I almost flipped out. But it all worked out. It was a great experience for them. They loved it. They went for years. And the other big turning point for me was, it was the summer of 2020. It was the summer of COVID. At that point, the kids they were 14 years old. During that summer, during COVID, if you remember, it was like everything just stopped. There were no really interactions. All the activities stopped. The kids were homebound, even for school. So during every summer, we would plan activities for the kids every day of the week. It was like, whatever, soccer and, arts and crafts or ultimate frisbee. It was just something every day. Summer of COVID, there was nothing. Even the prevailing wisdom was, if you're going to do a play date, it shouldn't be more than 2 kids, and they should wear masks and all this other stuff. Now, my son had a really great friend group. It was about 10 guys, and during that summer, they would get together at one of the kids' house. It was one of the kids in particular was Evan. They had a great backyard and everything else, so they would go there every day, and they were all riding their bikes, and that was the thing. That's what they did. Christopher had a bike, but I was super restrictive about him using it, only on bike paths or whatever. But that summer, I realized, if I prohibited him from riding his bike on the roads, he wouldn't have been able to, hang out with his friends, because that's what they did. And I got to say, we kind of live out in the boonies, so you think, oh, country roads, nice and safe. It's not really. There's no city traffic or anything like that, but the roads where we live, they're these long, windy roads, and the speed limits are anywhere from 35 miles an hour. Some of them are 45, and the cars go really fast, and you can't see around curves. Our area is heavily wooded. So, I felt like, it was not the safest bike riding place to be, but I had to let go. I couldn't stop him from doing it, because that would have ruined his summer and would have just gotten in the way of his basically hanging out with his friends. And, it was only in the last year or two, my kids and I, every now and then, were like, what was your favorite, holiday, or what was your favorite vacation? We all talk about that. So I said, what was your best summer? And Christopher said, it was definitely the COVID summer. I just got to hang out with my friends. He said, we used to ride our bike, and I didn't know this. He said, we used to ride our bikes, for miles. He was like, we would drive, go all the way to Marlboro, which is that's far from our house. So I didn't know that, but he said it was like the best summer of my life. It was the best time of my life. And I thought to myself, thank God I got over my fears, and I let him do that. So I still worry about my kids, and if you're like me, kind of a very protective parent, what some might call a helicopter parent, I do sympathize. It's really hard. And of course, you do have to take precautions and be smart about what your kids do, and not subject them to unacceptable levels of risk. But you do have to let go at some point. You really do, because you can't protect your kids to the point where you're going to make it impossible. Some bad things happen to good people. What I do is I pray to the Lord. I get on my knees. I pray to God that He keep them safe, and know that they're in God's hands. And something bad could happen to them. Like I said, even for good God-fearing people, bad things happen. But there's really only so much you can do to control that. I mean, my kids are 20. I still worry about them. I still get on my knees and pray for them. Now it's the cars. My daughter, Coco, she has a job about a half hour from our house. So every day, during summer vacation hours, she has her summer job. She's on the highways. And, the highways near us, they're dangerous. But, that's life. Again, I got to kind of let it go and just pray for the best. So that's it for today. If this, video kind of resonated with you, if you enjoyed it, please do hit the subscribe button. I would love for you to be part of my community, and hopefully I can make videos that you enjoy going forward. So thanks. See you next time.